In this lesson, we're going to learn how to display validation errors. So if you jump across into your form component, I've actually removed the select value, which uses the ng value in favor of the value and the selected properties, just to keep things simple and nice and readable. All the source code is obviously going to be available, so you can go back and reference each version as well as using these videos. Now, the interesting thing is when we want to actually implement validation, is where we're using this template reference up here, we can actually use them on these elements themselves. So let's assume we want to create something called full name. Now, what can we export? Much like ng form, we can actually export the ng model. Now, ng model does so much more underneath than just a simple value binding such as this. It actually keeps track of validation states for us. So what we can do is log out this full name, but we can also look at the errors. Now again, we'll convert this to JSON and go and take a look at it in the browser. So in the browser, we have the value of Steve and we have null, which means that there are no errors. Now, if I remove Steve, you would expect an error to occur. However, we haven't actually told Angular that we need some validation. So this is where we can add something called the required attribute, which I'm sure you're used to when dealing with forms, and Angular will pick up this automatically and tie it into ng model. So as soon as we go back here, we can add this required attribute. It doesn't need a value, it just needs explicitly binding. What we're also going to do is add this required attribute to the passenger ID. Again, we're going to use ID equals, and then we're going to export the local ng model. So all these references are exporting the models for the particular input. So Angular is actually using this ng model binding, and we can simply reference it here. What we'll do beside here again is actually do the JSON, and we'll use the id.errors. So when we go back to the browser, we will see our errors come into place when we remove the values, because we've used the required attribute, and Angular and the ng model will know about this. So you can see that we have Steve. Now, if I remove that, you can see that we have this required and then true. So our form now has an error called required true. Now, this isn't local to the input itself. The actual ng form that controls the entire form actually has knowledge of this as well. So we can update this to Tardan. You can see the value goes away. If we empty this, we also get the required true error. And if we add the passenger ID back, null has become the value. So there are no errors in our actual form. There's also one more thing that we can do to log out the form errors. Now what we're going to do here is wrap this one in a div. Now what we can do is duplicate this and look at a property called valid. We're also going to put the words valid next to it so we can see that it's valid or not. Otherwise, we're going to look at something called invalid, and as you guessed it, we can look at something called invalid. So in our browser, we have valid true and invalid false, as you'd expect. Now, when we remove this, you can see that our form has then changed valid to false. So this ties in really nicely when we want to actually provide values and error check. So let's go back and implement our validation states. If we scroll up to our passenger name and passenger ID, this is where we actually want to implement the errors. Now what we can do is actually use this fullname.errors to implement our validation. So to do this, what we can do is create a div tag, and we'll close it off in here. And the passenger name, which is what we're using here, so we can say passenger name is required. All we can use is a star and then ngIf. Now, the interesting thing is we want to use this detail.fullname. However, we are exporting the ng model, which is keeping an eye on the actual validation states, as we've just seen. So to do this, what we actually want to do inside our ngIf is do fullname.errors. Now, you've seen in the DOM that this can either be null or it will be an object with required true. So in this case, if we have an error.required, this will work fine. However, if we're using null, this is going to throw an error. So again, we use the safe navigation operator just to make sure that if this becomes true, then this error is then shown to the user. Now what we're going to do here is just create a class called error and then just add some simple styling. So if you want to open up the passenger form.component.scss, we'll actually add some quick styles inside of here to separate our form out and add the error states. So the first thing that we'll do, just to give these divs a bit of breathing room, is we'll do div and then margin 0, 0, 20 pixels, just to give us some gaps. And the class that we just added is the class of error. It's going to have a color of DA and then 6969. And we'll bump the font size down slightly to 10 pixels. Now we'll close this off and go back to the browser. So you can see immediately we have no errors. If I remove Steve, it says passenger name is required. Now there's one interesting thing here is that if the name wasn't there to begin with, such as if we were creating a new passenger, this would actually display this error message before the user has even interacted with the form. So let's go back and fix this problem. Now to do this, we can use something called dirty. So what we can do is fullname.dirty. Now the dirty property means that the form controls value has changed. So if the user has actually interacted with it, such as deleted it, then this expression will be evaluated. What this means is at runtime, this error message will not be shown because fullname.dirty will actually be false because the user has not interacted with it. So we only want to show these errors once a user has interacted. Now again, for the passenger ID, we're going to do something similar. So I'm going to highlight this and scroll down. We're going to replace this ID errors JSON and just paste this one in. We'll change these full names to ID. We're going to use the exact same setup with errors and the question mark. We're looking for the required attribute again. And instead of passenger name is required, we're just going to use passenger ID as required. So if we go and empty the ID and also empty the name, the errors then appear. We can then start adding them back and start adding them back and the errors disappear. And these will just update as the user is typing. So these are really handy when we want to display error messages at specific point in times. There are also properties such as the .touched property. So if I then touch this input and then left the input, that would actually fire what we call a touch. So instead of using dirty here, we could just change this to touched, which means that if there was no value to begin with, and the user clicked on the input and then left the input, this error would actually show. So it depends on your validation strategy of which you want to use. I personally prefer using dirty over touched because it allows the user interaction first and gives them a gentle reminder if they've deleted something via their own input. So in this video, you've learned about the basic validation. You've learned how to create a template reference, which exports a reference to the ng model. So we're binding the ng model, which is the details.id. What's important to note is that all this is doing is setting the initial value of the ng model, and ng model is taking care of lots more under the hood. Now, by using a template ref, we're actually gaining access to what ng model is doing. So you can see here we have errors and dirty and all these different required properties. You can also implement things such as min length if you had 0, and these would be available such as min length. So it's very extensible and you can use multiple different errors if you like. So you could copy this, we could add a min length if we wanted to, and add a min length property here. However, for this demo, we don't need it, but now you know how to do this kind of stuff with your forms to show and hide based on the validation states.